Magnify my master. Song number 1 out of the supplement book. We'll sing all 3 verses. Oh, me. Oh, magnify my master, exalt his holy name. His name I praise forever, forever and again. To heights of all thy glory, to heights beyond the sky, to far beyond creation, to him let praises fly. With words of adoration, with songs of endless praise, from hearts that know the gladness for love of heaven's ways, and from realms majestic where saints of ages roam, with joy my soul would cherish praise Jesus all day long. As well as I may praise thee in my own fragile way, nor with my soul, O Jesus, could I thy love repay. I sing of all thy graces, I bow and laud thy care, and take of all thy blessings, I see them everywhere. Next song will also be out of the supplement book, The Rock of My Heart. Song number 52 out of the supplement. The Rock of My Heart. We'll sing all 3 verses of this song. Oh, me. My Lord, I need nothing beside you. Without you, I could not have dedication song will be Living by Faith, song number 101 out of the supplement book, Living by Faith. But before the lesson, we'll sing His Grace Reaches Me, song number 596 out of the Hymns for Worship, His Grace Reaches Me. If it's convenient for you, would you please stand for this song? Deeper than the ocean and wider than the sea is the grace of the Savior for sinners like me. Sent from the Father, and it thrills my soul just to feel and to know that His blood makes me whole. His grace reaches me, yes, His grace reaches me, and will last through eternity. Now I'm under His control, and I'm happy in my soul. Just to know that His grace reaches me. Higher than the mountains and wider than the sun, it was offered at Calvary for everyone. Greatest of treasures, and His light today, though my sins were as scarlet, He has washed them away. His grace reaches me, yes, His grace reaches me, and will last through eternity. Now I'm under His control, and I'm happy in my soul. Just to know that His grace reaches me. Please be seated.
You know, some years ago when I was closing out a gospel meeting as a much younger preacher, I was trying to think of something very clever to say at the conclusion of the week. And I said, well, you know, all good things must come to an end. A dear lady met me after services and she said, well, that's true, Brother Bronger, but all bad things come to an end too. So I don't say that anymore. I would like to take just a moment, though, and tell you how much Sue and I appreciate so very much being here. I understood what Bruce was saying about Sue. I know when I went to Blue Springs a few years back, and they asked me to come out and work with them, they said they really wanted Sue, but they had to take me to get her. And so I fully understand that. But thank you all so much for having us this week. You were very kind to us. I was mentioning to Sue last evening how, you may not realize it or not. Bruce will tell you, you when you're speaking, you kind of feed off of the people that you're speaking to, and believe me, the way you were allowing me to feed off of you and you off of me, you're easy to speak to. And I appreciate that. It says a lot, at least in my mind, about your spiritual character and your spiritual composition. So I do want to thank you for that. I want to thank the elders for the invitation to come and be with you. Somebody was asking me, do you know anybody out here besides Bruce? I kind of do, but not really. But I do thank you for allowing me to be a part of you this week. You were very, very kind. You're very generous in your hospitality. I want to thank those of you who had us into your homes or otherwise took us out for a meal. You were very, very kind, very hospitable. And to me, it's the epitome of what Christian hospitality is, and you have extended that to us. And I'll tell you, tonight, the song leading tonight, like every night, don't you have any bad song leaders? I don't think that you do. Excellent singing, and I just appreciate that. As Bruce was telling me all this week, he said, you know, good singing makes bad preaching better. Yeah, I got you. It was a joy to be with Bruce, and I'm so sorry that what happened in Rachel's family, it took you away for a couple of days. Fully understand, appreciate that, appreciate your love of family. But it's good to be with him. He is a good man, a godly man. You know that. I don't need to tell you that. And Bruce is the kind of guy that when I'm around, I just want to be better. And when I grow up, I want to be just like Bruce Reeves. But thank you all so very much for your genuine kindness. The song leading was excellent. Those who led in prayer, appreciate you so very much. Yasua and I are going to be leaving in the morning. Keep us in your prayers. We're going to get back and resume the work that we're engaged in the Kansas City area. And so you pray for me, and believe me, I will certainly keep this congregation in my prayers. And there's a couple of people that I have spoken to directly in this congregation and promised you that I'm going to be praying for you, and I want you to know that has already begun, and I will continue to do that. Thank you. When the Apostle Paul, sometime during the winter of 53 or 54 AD, took pen in hand, he wrote what is to come to be known as the book of 2 Corinthians. The book of 2 Corinthians, unlike some of the other writings of the Apostle Paul, at least in the estimation of the speaker, is not as easily outlined. You know, you read 1 Corinthians, it's outlined so very easily. You know, almost each chapter, or at least sections of chapters, deal with various problems. 2 Corinthians, in my judgment, doesn't break down quite that easily, although when you look into the book, you can see that Paul deals with false teachers and false teaching in the book, as, you know, would be expected, considering some of the things that he was encountering in the first century. He also deals with something that occurred back in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 with the man who was involved in sin, dealt with and disciplined by the congregation. Paul seems to suggest in the second epistle of the Corinthians that, you know, he kind of got it together, and he can, he encouraged the congregation to extend love to this man. And so, you know, during all of the writings of 2 Corinthians, Paul deals with various issues. But as you get to the latter part of the book, Paul begins to say something that is very arresting as far as our attention is concerned. And so I want to ask you to open 2 Corinthians to chapter 12, and I'd like to read along with you the first 6 verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Because Paul says, as he's concluding this, he deals with something that's not directly associated with all that he'd been talking about, although there may be a connection. And he says in chapter 12, in verse 1 of 2 Corinthians, "It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know. God knows. Such a one was caught up to the third heaven." Now, when you read that, I mean, this is immediately capturing your attention. Wow. Imagine that. I believe that Paul is talking about himself in the third person here, that it was he who was caught up into the third heaven, and he was able to be shown some things. He said in verse 3, I know a man, and I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows, how he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except in my infirmities. For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. But I refrain, lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. So, Paul is talking about, again, I believe, of himself being caught up into the third heaven and shown these things that he said, I just can't express them. I cannot reveal them. I cannot talk about them. And so this would have been something that would have caused Paul, possibly anybody for that matter, to be exalted. Wow, I was chosen. This is something I was allowed to see. But rather than causing Paul to boast about that, and rather than causing Paul to be highly exalted about that, he says something else occurred. He said, you know what happened? He said, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan. He said, to buffet me. Now just think about the contrast here. Shown the glories of paradise, but yet he was not allowed to, wasn't able to boast in that. He said, rather, I was given a thorn in the flesh. That was given to me. The word, when you think about a thorn here, you're thinking about something that causes pain and annoyance. So this is what he's talking. He's really speaking of this sort of metaphorically. He's using a figure of speech. Paul, I don't believe, had a literal thorn off of a thorn bush or a thorn tree that was penetrating into his side. He's using a figure of speech. We do that. We talk about something being a pain in the neck or a thorn in our side. And so these are figures, and you know what that means. That means that we have something that's causing an annoyance, something that's causing some emotional pain. And so Paul is using that figure that way. It's not the first time that it's used in the Scriptures. As a matter of fact, you look back in the Old Testament, God had warned the people, the children of Israel, after coming out of Egyptian captivity, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your side, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. So Paul was given this thorn in the flesh. Now, that's sort of an interesting thing. And how many times when you talk about a thorn in the flesh, the whole concept is interesting. But how many times do we want to scratch our head and wonder what is that? What is Paul's thorn in the flesh? What was it? This is something you hear it talked about in sermons and classes and maybe even in just private studies. We wonder about it. Well, was it something physical? I've read where the case has been made that really what Paul had was chronic malaria, perhaps migraine headaches, epilepsy, speech impediment, or poor eyesight. All of these have been suggested that was Paul's thorn in the flesh. Some people think that it was not physical, but rather emotional, because Paul had a deep concern for the churches that he worked with. As a matter of fact, he said in the same book, chapter 11 and verse 28, what comes upon me daily? My deep concern for all the churches. Was it physical? Remember, he's speaking metaphorically. Or was it emotional? Some make the case that it was adversarial. Paul suffered a lot. He was, as a matter of fact, in chapter 11, he points out that, from the Jews, verse 24, he received 40 stripes minus one, and then he goes listing all of the things that happened to him from his adversaries. Was it that? Or was he just mentally discouraged? We do not know what the thorn in the flesh was. That is not important. If it were important, God would have revealed to us what it was. But what we do know that the thorn in the flesh was sent for a reason. It was sent to buffet Paul. Now, the idea of buffet here is the idea of tormenting, as the New American Standard Bible would translate that, a continual source of torment. And we don't know what it was, but we do know that it was a source of torment that was going to continue on and on and on. It was intended to destroy Paul. It was intended to torment him to the point that he would grow discouraged and it would destroy him. But I'll tell you something else that we can know about it. We can know the source of the thorn. Paul says it was given to him by Satan. Satan is the one who provided this thorn in the flesh. Notice that's how it reads. A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan. And he said it was given to buffet me. Now, if you notice in chapter 11 and verse 14, to the Corinthians, Satan transformed himself into an angel of light. But now to the Apostle Paul, Satan was an angel of agony. He was the source of that thorn in the flesh. Now, let me tell you something about that. I just want to catch your attention with this right here. I do not want any of us to reach the point that we are so spiritually sophisticated that we deny the existence of the evil one. The devil is a real being. And let's get that down at the outset here. We're not talking about anything that's a fabrication here. We're talking about the angel of agony. We're talking about the devil. And I want to tell you today, the devil is the source of all our suffering. The devil is the source of all the suffering that we experience on this earth. So, and I'm going to tell you something else about that. When we begin to suffer like the Apostle Paul, whatever his suffering was, when we begin to suffer, that becomes a corridor into the heart of every believer that the devil uses. I want you to remember that. We're going to focus upon that a little bit later on. But I want you to notice also, if this is a messenger of Satan, I want you to understand that everything that Satan says, everything that he suggests is a lie. He is a liar and the father of lies. Any message of the devil is a lie. But when we suffer, that is the corridor into our hearts where the devil can plant these lies. I'm going to tell you something. Like the Apostle Paul, we need not think that our lives are going to be free of any difficulties. We're going to have difficulties. I tell people, just because you become a Christian doesn't mean that you've been inoculated from the problems of this world. It doesn't mean when you're raised out of the waters of baptism that now you're going to have a shield around you and you're not going to suffer the ravages of life. No, that's not so. We're going to have problems and difficulties in life. Jesus said in John 16 and verse 33, in this world you will have tribulation. Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12 that we ought not be surprised when these fiery trials come upon us, because they're indeed going to happen. And all we've got to look at is our life the last couple of years. And you know, we see that throughout the world we're walking around in a panic and in a concern because of what happened, the pandemic that has just settled upon us. We ought not be surprised about these kinds of things. There are going to be problems and difficulties in life. We're going to experience the same ravages that the whole world experiences. We're going to have sicknesses. We're going to have families who need to be healed. We're going to have hearts that need to be melted. There are going to be these kinds of issues. We're going to have problems that need to be solved. But I want you to know something. When heartaches and hardships and pain and unhappiness and suffering fills your life, this is a messenger of Satan. It is not God. Yes, God permits it. But I'm kind of reminded of the parable of the tares. You remember that in Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the tares? When the landowner sowed the wheat, you know, and then in the evening somebody comes up and sows tares or darnel or noxic weeds in that field, and they grow up together, and they say, well, wait a minute. What was it the Lord said? He said, an enemy has done this. And he identified in verse 28 the enemy as the devil. So when there are problems that are sown in your life, it's not God, it is the devil that has sown these things. When we suffer sickness or we suffer heartbreak or heartaches or tragedies in our life, it's not God, it is a messenger of Satan. Now, what did Paul do? What did Paul do when that messenger of Satan inflicted him, when that thorn in the flesh came upon him? What did he do? Well, let's notice what he did. He said, concerning this thing, he did what you and I would do. He prayed about it. He said, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. Now just think about that. Somebody said, just 3 times? Just 3? You know, he wasn't like the widow that went to the unjust judge and just over and over. No, he said, I prayed for it 3. I don't know. I don't know whether Paul prayed 3 times in rapid succession or whether he prayed 3 times over a period of 14 years. He said it's been that long since this happened. I don't know. But one thing that I do know, I do know that when he prayed about it, the answer that he received from God was not one that he was perhaps hoping for, because God said, no, I'm not going to remove it. My grace is sufficient for you. That was God's response. My grace is sufficient. Now I want you to stop and consider this. It seems, at least in my estimation, that after Paul received that message from God, that there was a sense of finality that began to set in. Okay, I get it. I understand. I just got to live with it. It's not going to be removed, but you know that's what's going to happen. I'm just going to live with it. Notice what he said in the latter part of verse 9. After Jesus told him, "My grace is sufficient for you," he said, "Therefore." Notice the finality that sits in on this. "Most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." How can that be? Well, he was bearing this thorn in the flesh. It was a period of weakness for him, but he said, you know what? When I am weak, I lean upon my source of strength. His grace is sufficient for me. You ever just stop and try to consider the magnitude of that statement? Have you stopped to consider the profundity of the statement, "My grace is sufficient for you"? I want you to just stop and let that, soak in. We talk about grace only in the context of salvation, and that is unfortunate. Yes, it is the means by which we are saved. We're saved by faith or by grace through faith, that not of ourselves, it's the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast, Paul said in Ephesians 2, verses 9 and 10. He's not saying grace only, but it's the means by which God saves us. It is by His grace. Yes, Paul was saved by the grace of God through his obedience to the gospel. When Ananias told him to arise and be baptized, and he obeyed that and had his sins washed away, he was saved not by works of merit, but by the grace of God. He said in 1 Corinthians 15, he pointed out, he said, "But I am what I am by the grace of God." Just think about it. God's grace was able to take a persecutor, a man who was responsible for the murder of Christians. God's grace was able to make that persecutor into a preacher. He was able to take a sinner and make a saint out of him by the grace of God. He made an assassin into an apostle. And if God's grace can make Paul what he was, that sinner who became a saint, that same grace is going to be able to sustain Paul while he was bearing this thorn in the flesh. It will carry Paul through. It will sustain you, Paul. And ladies and gentlemen, that truth remains today. That truth has not in any way weakened. Maybe we're not able to fix everything that we would like to have fixed in our lives. It may be that we're going to have to suffer some things that just absolutely crush us. There are going to be things that happen in our life that's not going to be removed. And we're going to be like Paul, and we're going to pray about it. And the answer is going to be basically no. You are going to have to bear this. My grace is sufficient for you. My grace will carry you through. You know, and I'm going to tell you, we can't bear it alone. We have to cast our care upon Him, as Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. We have to cast our care upon Him because He cares for us. So there are going to be times that we're going to shed bitter tears. There are going to be times that our hearts are broken. There are going to be times that the night is long and we think it will never end. And God is going to say no. We're going to pray. We're going to pour our hearts out to God. And God is going to say no. My grace is sufficient for you. I don't know if you've been there yet, but you will be. You will reach a point, my friend, where you pray that the thorn will be removed, but the reality of it is not removed. You have to deal with it. You have to live with it. And even though it's very difficult to live with it, the truth of the Scripture still remains. My grace is sufficient for you. So what do we do then? What do we do when the finality of this begins to set in? What do we do when the thorn is not removed? Well, let's talk about that, because those are the things that I want to leave you with as this meeting finds a conclusion. Because I recognize that just as in my life, in your life, there are going to be thorns that you're going to have to bear. And they're not going to be removed. That's the reality of it. But there are things that we can do while we're bearing those thorns in the flesh. And the first thing that I want you to do is I want you to reject the lying message of the devil. Because this is going to be the time that the devil begins, as it were, to whisper into your ear and into your heart some things that are not so. And you have to reject those, categorically reject those. Because when we begin to suffer, the devil will show up. And he will begin to fill our hearts with lies, and these lies are intended to destroy us. What are some of those lies? Some of those lies would be, you know, God has abandoned you. Don't you know that? Look, you've served God all of these years. You've prayed and you've been to church all of these years, and now you're suffering and you're going through this, and God doesn't care anything about you. God has abandoned you. That's a lie of the devil. Or we believe the lie that, you know, God is unfair. God doesn't love me. God is punishing me. Or perhaps there is no God. These are lies of the devil. And remember, suffering is the corridor through which these lies are going into your heart. Reject them. Rather than believing the lies of the devil, believe what Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you. So you reject the lies of the devil. And then I'll tell you something else that you need to do. When you begin to suffer and you realize the thorn is not going to be removed, the thorn is not removed. Not only do you reject the lying message of the devil, but now is a time to up. Now is a time to revive your prayer life and your dependence upon prayer. You need prayer now more than ever. But you say, JR, I prayed about this and God did not remove the thorn. I understand that. I hear you. I know where you're coming from. And it may seem like your prayers didn't get any higher than the ceiling. But it's not a time to stop praying. Pray. Pour your hearts out to God, even if you don't feel like it. Even if you feel like it's not doing any good. Revive up your prayer life. Don't stop worshiping God. This is not a time to bail on God. It's not a time to break off communication with God. This is a time to enliven and renew and revive your prayer life. More than ever, do what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 17, pray without ceasing. You know what this looks like? I'm going to tell you what it looks like. You remember back in the Old Testament in 2 Kings chapter 19, when Hezekiah, the good king Hezekiah, received word that Sennacherib was bringing the Assyrian army and he was going to annihilate Jerusalem and he was going to kill all the inhabitants. And he sent word to Hezekiah. And he sent a letter to Hezekiah telling him, your God has abandoned you and he will not intervene on your behalf. What did Hezekiah do? You and I know well what Hezekiah did. He went to the temple and he laid that letter out before God and he turned it all over to God. This is not a time to bail on God. I'm going to tell you something. I have been there. I have received news that I did not want to receive. I've received information that I wished I had never received, and the only thing that I could do was lay it before God and said, it is out of my hands. It's not a time to walk away from God. It's a time to reconnect. My grace is sufficient for you. A number of years ago, my oldest daughter was 25 years old, and we received word that she had uterine cancer. And they began to give her chemotherapy for her uterine cancer. And every time that they started the chemotherapy, we would receive word from the doctor, this type is not working. And they said, well, we're going to switch over to this kind of chemotherapy. And this kind of chemotherapy works in 80% of the people. She fell in the 20% range. This chemotherapy is not working. And every time that she would take chemotherapy, I'd be up there at the hospital with her. It was going IVs, and we knew how sick she was going to be, and we knew how it was going to affect her. And I remember sitting there with her one day. I just taken about all that a daddy could take. And I walk out of a room, and I go stand this catwalk. It was in Indianapolis, and I'm watching cars and trucks go under this catwalk at the hospital. And I'm praying, and I'm praying, and I'm crying just like any father would do. And I go back in that hospital room, and she sees my face is red, my eyes are red from crying. She said, Daddy, I want you to sit down here, and I want you to listen to me. I said, what is it, baby? She reaches up, and she takes hold of my hand. And she said, Daddy, I don't want you to cry anymore. She said, if I get well, I'll go home, and if I don't get well, I'll go home. I said, thank you, baby girl, for teaching me a lesson of dependence and trust upon God. God was merciful, and He spared her, and I'm thankful to that. But nevertheless, it may not have turned out that way. But one thing that I realize from the tragedies that we face and experience in life, that if God doesn't calm the storm, He calms the heart so that I can endure the storm. Revive your prayer dependence upon God. It's not time to bail. And if the thorn is not removed, resist. Resist the urge to become bitter. Bitter perhaps toward God for allowing this to happen. I know that's a danger. I know that's a temptation. Resist it. Don't be like Job's wife. In Job 2 and verses 9 and 10, she said, Job, just curse God and die. No, you speak like a foolish woman. Shall we not accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? I'm not going to do that. This is not a time to become embittered. In this world we will have tribulation. Job put it this way in Job 14 and verse 1, man who is born of a woman is a few days and full of trouble. When we are enduring these things, don't become bitter. Just remember, an enemy has done this. But I'll tell you another urge that we have very often at times like this is we have urges to become embittered to someone who is not suffering what we're suffering. I don't get it. Why is it we've got to go through this? Why is it I've got to go through this? You know, these other people are not going through this. These other people, as a matter of fact, these other people don't even go to church. These other people don't even love the Lord, and I'm going through this. And they're not, and if we're not careful, we sort of become embittered at them. Dear friend of mine, L.A. Stouffer, was telling me about the time that he lost his wife to breast cancer. He said after Shirley initially was diagnosed and had her surgery and her treatments, and things went well for a while, but he said, you know, that cancer came back, and it came back and ravaged her. He said, I remember the last night when Shirley was in the hospital. He said, JR, I wished I could pray again like I prayed then. He said, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed that Shirley would live. He said, and Shirley died. He said, JR, I went down to the chapel in that little hospital. And he said, I was so angry. He said, I had such a rage in my heart. He said, I had hate in my heart, but he said it wasn't for God. He said it was at the devil. He said, because the devil has done this. And he said, I wished I could have that same hatred alive in my heart for the devil every day that I live. Yes, it's a time to be angry, and it's a time to be filled with rage, but not at God and not at those who perhaps are not suffering the things that we're suffering. You remember what I'm sure you do, the psalmist wrote? He said in Psalm 73 in verse 12 beginning, he said, behold, these are the ungodly who are always at ease. They increase in riches. Surely I have cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocence, for all day long I have been plagued and chastened every morning. If I had said, I will speak thus, behold, I would have been untrue to the generation of your children. When I thought how to understand this, he said, it was too painful for me. But then there was this epiphany. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. I'm going to tell you, my friends, you fight and you resist and you overcome the urges to become embittered. And remember the promise. My grace is sufficient for you. It's also a time to reestablish spiritual relationships. Do not cut off and isolate yourself from your brethren, from the Christians who love and care for you. Satan will want you during your weakest times, which is when you're suffering. Satan will want you to isolate yourself. He will want you to be alone because that will then make you more vulnerable. And there are going to be people who reach out to you. You reach back. You reach back to those people. They're wanting to help you. They're wanting to be there for you. Don't cut yourself off from them. Reach back and let them help you. You know, suffering it will make us either sullen or it will make us become a servant to other people. If we're sullen, what we're going to do is isolate ourselves. We'll dig a hole. We'll be like Elijah. We'll find a cave and we'll run off and hide in it. That's what the devil wants us to do. But if we allow it to make us a servant, you know what we will do? We will be able to be triumphant through that suffering, and then we'll be able to help others who are suffering. Listen to how the Apostle Paul put it in the first chapter of the book of 2 Corinthians. He discusses this idea of being able to reach out and help others. He said in chapter 1 and verse 3, he said, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort." He said, "Who comforts us in all our tribulation." You know, my grace is sufficient for you. He comforts us in all of our tribulation. Why? That we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. But you know, sometimes with that, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say to somebody who is suffering. I want to be able to say the perfect thing. I want to be able to say that which is going to help. A friend of mine just told me a number of years ago, his father died suddenly right around the holiday season in December. Wasn't expecting it. He said went to the funeral home, of course, and there was his father laid out. He said people were coming in, they were so kind and so gracious, and they had such kind words to say, and reminding him that we're praying for you, and we love you, and we want to help you. He said, and then he saw a guy walk in. And he said the guy walked up and said he never said a word. All he did, he said, was just throw his arms around me, put his head on my shoulder, my head was on his shoulder, and we stood there and we cried together. He said that was the greatest comfort that I had. He said because 2 weeks before that he had buried his father and he knew the hurt that I felt. Let's not isolate ourselves. Let's encourage one another. Let's reestablish these spiritual relationships because we can find comfort. And if I've gone through something, I can help someone go through that. I know how you feel. I've been where you are. So don't isolate yourself. Don't let the devil exploit that feeling that you have. When the thorn is not removed, finally, rely unconditionally upon God. This is so very important. Yes, I understand. Life as we've known it, life as we've loved it, has been blown apart. It's been blown to pieces and it will never be the same again. But this is not a time to walk away from God. It is a time to trust Him. It is a time to recognize that God will, hear me friend, God will put the pieces back together again. It may not be in this life, but God will put the pieces back together. The proverb writer reminds us that we're to trust in the Lord with all of our heart, Proverbs 3 and verse 5, and not lean upon our own understanding. Paul said in Romans 8 and verse 18 that I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Don't rely upon your own understanding. Things may not be put back together here. But I love this passage that's found in the 3rd chapter of the book of the minor prophet Habakkuk. Because it describes in words that there's no way that I could improve upon them. Habakkuk says this in this hymn of faith, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. God has provided something much better than what we experience here upon this earth. God has provided us a home and habitation that's not built with human hands. And so while I traverse this wicked land in which I live with all the trials and tribulations and the sorrows and the tears and the heartaches, I'm relying upon God as He has promised me, my grace is sufficient for you. Because of suffering, we have become so very vulnerable to the lies of Satan. I remember a story from a long time ago about a little boy who was playing in the backyard. He had this Tonka truck that he was out there making a little road so he could play with his Tonka truck. And his daddy was watching him through the window. And there was a cinder block that was half buried in the ground where that little boy wanted to drive his truck. And he sat down on the ground, put his little feet on that block and pushed and pushed and pushed and couldn't move. He thought about it for a minute and he went over and found a stick and he tried to wedge it under there and try to loosen that block and it wouldn't budge. And finally his daddy come out there and stood there and asked him, said, "Son, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm trying to remove this block. It's blocking my road." And Daddy said, "Well, son, have you done everything that you can do?" He said, "Yes, sir, I've done everything and I can't move." His daddy said, "No, you haven't done everything." He said, "Well, what haven't I done?" He said, "You haven't asked me. Daddy, would you move the rock?" Daddy reached down, moved it. We've got rocks in our lives that's blocking what we want to do and what we want to accomplish, and it's a thorn. God may not remove that block, but I promise you that God will give you sufficient grace to calm the storm that's raging in your heart, and you can overcome, and you can live faithful to God, allowing Him one day to put the pieces back together. And when you hear those precious words, "Well done, my good and faithful servant," all the suffering that you've encountered will suddenly evaporate in the presence of the Lord. If you're not a Christian tonight, please do not try to live your life without dependence upon God. If you believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, please repent of your sins, turn from them. Confess your faith that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Be baptized in water for the remission of your sins, raised to walk in newness of life, and live a life of trust. Even though the world may shatter around you, you're part of a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Don't you want to be there? If you do, why don't you come right now? As together we stand as we sing.
I care not today what the far weary shadow or sunshine or rain.